everyone, and welcome to our hot topic webinar for volunteers and volunteer managers today. Today we're talking about grief, bereavement and loss, and we're delighted to have Chris Hall from Grief Australia joining us as our expert speaker today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands of wherever we are today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Recognise anyone in the session today or anyone watching this online later with First Nations heritage, and to acknowledge that sad news and sorry business happens on the lands and seas around us as well. And it takes the community to look after each other. And the Aboriginal population and the Torres Strait Islanders have had a huge amount of history in this space, and we have a lot to learn from them as well. So my name's Shyla. I'm the CEO of Palliative Care South Australia, and we run the Palliative Care Volunteering South Australia project, which supports and advocates for volunteers across the state. So we're delighted that you can join us today. This session will be recorded and made available online for people to watch later as well. If you're watching it live today, there is a chat area and a Q&A area in the Zoom function where you can put any questions you'd like there. If we have time today, I'll ask those questions, or Chris will respond to those questions. If not, we'll respond to them in email afterwards to you as a group, so you get the response that way. But feel free to pop any chat questions that way into the webinar. All right, these are short, sharp and important conversations and to learn from. So I'll hand over now to Chris. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlotte, for that very warm introduction, and it's lovely to be joining you here today. You'll see a QR code on the screen. That will take you to a copy of all the materials that you'll see on the screen. So don't feel that you need to furiously take notes for the next half an hour. And that link next to that PDF icon will take you to the same place. And we'll put that up again at the end and make that available for you. So let's begin. And again, I just really want to echo Shyla's comments and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet. Meeting on the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in the Yarra Valley just outside Melbourne. And we also bear witness to the deep grief carried by First Nations people born of injustice and loss, and also moved by the extraordinary strength, resilience and spirit in the face of those enduring hardships. So let's jump straight in and talk about what is grief.
Chris,
grief
sorry to interrupt. Your screen is not sharing. Just to add that
it's not sharing. Okay.
Yes.
Let me go back and how is that?
That's perfect. Perfect.
Lovely. Okay. Sorry about that. For that false start. So as I said, this QR code will take you to a copy of the handout materials, and we'll make that available for you. So what is grief? So grief fundamentally is our response to loss. And although we often think about that loss in relationship to a death, of course, there are many losses, there are many changes that are often unwelcome or unbidden that we have to deal with. It is more than just an emotional response to loss. It's multifaceted. And in a sense, you arrive already experts in the subject. We have all loved, we've all lost, we've all experienced grief. There is clearly a strong feelings dimension, and we can identify those. Those might be sadness, anxiety, concern, but they also might be other feelings, even positive ones, such as a sense of relief or a sense of a challenging time having come to an end. Grief affects our body. We know that grief depresses our immune function. Grieving people are much more likely to suffer from a range of physical complaints, from a cough and cold through to more serious health impacts. We do know that people die of broken hearts when we look at the impact of cardiac events in people who've experienced profound loss. We know that it affects people's sleep, and insomnia is one of the very common features of grief that people talk about. It affects the way we think. Many people talk about, I think I'm going crazy, and it might be a range of thoughts that people are struggling with, and it might be particular thoughts that capture their attention, and those thoughts kind of ruminate or roll over and over in our heads as we try to make sense of our loss. It also affects the way we behave. and people talk about a kind of a bone-numbing exhaustion, a tiredness that comes with their grief. Others talk about a kind of a manic overactivity, but there are a range of behaviours we see also in grief. And of course, grief is not just something that happens in the head and heart of an individual. We grieve in community, we grieve in relationships. So families, for example, will grieve together. And families will often have feeling or grieving rules, the extent to which we talk about the person who died, or we talk about this experience of loss, or we don't, the extent to which we might put photographs out on display or not. Workplaces too have feeling and grieving rules. To what extent can we take our experience of loss with us to work, and to what extent will other people in community recognise our experience of loss? We live in a culture where you get 3 days bereavement leave after the death of a family member. That's a pretty strong cultural message that grief is like the flu. After 3 days, life more or less returns to normal. And we know that that's simply not the case. And I think perhaps the final and perhaps the most overlooked one is that grief often raises big questions for people, big questions of meaning. Why did this happen? This challenge of making sense, wrapping not just our heart, but our head around what's happened. Also, it raises big questions, often of a spiritual nature. In the case of death, where are they now? And this sense of what does this separation from this person we love mean? So it's really important that we recognise that grief comes in many forms. And the first example I have up here is having a child, which of course we would see it as a very positive experience, but it does cast a shadow of loss, of change. So people talk often about the changes in career, financially, spontaneity, changes in identity, changes in terms of one's own body. So often even a positive change in our lives can bring with it a kind of a shadow of grief. Of course, children growing up, leaving home. It also might be an intangible loss, a loss of a sense of safety. Somebody, for example, who's a victim of crime, who doesn't feel safe traveling on public transport. So this sense of a loss of predictability or security. The idea of moving house. I remember when I was 11 years of age and moved from New South Wales to Victoria and leaving behind a peer group, moving into a whole new set of circumstances of living. For me at 11, I felt as a profound grief. These might be losses that are more physical, loss of hearing, sight, those that may come with aging, having a child with a disability. So really what we see here is from the cradle to the grave, a range of grief experiences that we all struggle with. And we often are supporting other people as they struggle with these experiences as well. It's really important that we emphasise that grief is a normal and natural and inevitable reaction to loss. It's an adaptive process that helps us make sense of our loss, to integrate loss into our lives, and to be able to transition into a new part of our lives. Grief can be painful, but it's also a healing process. It's an adaptive process, and it's certainly not a sign of pathology. And so it's really important to emphasize that, as has been said many times, grief is the price we pay for love. It's the price we pay for making connections. And part of the price we pay is being social beings and forming connections and relationships with others. There's a wonderful book that came out in 2020 by a woman called Maggie Farrell. It's a fictional account of William Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, who died at the age of 11 in 1596. And it focuses on his parents' grief. And we know from the writings of Shakespeare that his world was never the same after the death of Hamnet. In fact, shortly after Hamnet died, he wrote in Macbeth, about 10 years later, and writes, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the all-fraught heart and bids it break." In this book, there's a lovely section at the end where his wife isn't able to kind of locate his grief, and so she goes to London and she sees a performance of Hamlet, which is really a story of a son struggling with the grief for his father and anger at the circumstances of the death. And in that he says, "When sorrow comes, they come not as single spies, but in battalions. The idea that we never grieve one thing at a time. We're dealing with multiple losses, and there are often consequential losses as well. Again, the cartoonist Michael Lunick, I think, sums this up nicely with this man meditating upon a duck in a graveyard, the death of God, friends, family, fairies. So it's very often that one loss will beget other losses. So the death of a partner will produce other changes. They might be financial, accommodation. I remember speaking to my mother after my father died, and she said she went to the bank. My father, a fairly traditional marriage, managed the finances. So my mother talked about going to the bank, walking up to the bank teller, and just bursting into tears and feeling such a fool. This was something that her husband did. I spoke to him a little while ago, whose husband always kept her car topped up with petrol. And so she found herself in tears as she's pulled into the service station, unable to find the fuel filler cap to release the petrol cap. So again, this idea that it's not just one loss we're dealing with, we're often dealing with battalions, many, many losses. If you're as old as me, you probably remember overhead transparencies, these little acetate sheets we used to put on machines that would project onto a wall. In the mid-90s, this is one that I used. It's not one I would use today. This has grief, and so we're living our life, and we go through this kind of valley of reorganization, and we come out the other end, and that life's more or less kind of returned to some kind of normal. And we're now very skeptical about the idea that there's a predictable trajectory that grieving people go through. It's far more complex than this kind of overhead transparency might suggest. And as somebody on social media said, perhaps this is a better reflection of their experience. It's chaotic. There are no simple steps or phases or tasks that people go through. A very common model that many people are familiar with is the idea of the 5 stages of grief, put forward by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the American-Swiss psychiatrist, that suggests we go through denial, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, and then acceptance. And the reality is that there's no evidence to support this at all. There are no 5 stages of grief. There's no cookie-cutter approach to grief. There's not necessarily the emotional promised land of acceptance where it's all done and dusted. And in fact, later research has shown that there's multiple pathways through grief. The most common one is one of resiliency, where people following the death of a partner, 35 to 60% of people manage to rebound and deal with some resiliency. But of course, there are other patterns as well. Some people whose grief remains very high over a long period of time. Another group who take some time to, in a sense, recover from their grief, and others where their grief becomes more complex as time goes on. So what we often see is resiliency, but we also see sometimes where something derails this very normal process of grief. The other is that there's often been this long-held belief that what we need to do is to say goodbye and to let go of the person who's died or that loss. And we now know that that's not the case. That death ends a life, it doesn't end a relationship. People maintain an ongoing and continuing bond with a person who died. And people maintain this relationship in many ways. And so grief isn't about letting go or saying goodbye. It's about moving from a relationship where a person is physically present to a relationship of memory. Again, this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes has this boy running up to his dad. Dad, did you check on a little raccoon this morning? Yes, Calvin, I'm afraid he died. I'm sorry too, kiddo, but he didn't stand much of a chance. At least he died warm and safe, Calvin. We did all we could, but now he's gone. And Calvin says, I know. I'm crying because out there he's gone, but he's not gone inside me. So again, the idea that we carry these relationships, these connections. Many people maintain these connections through conversations with the deceased, by visiting cemeteries and a range of other things that they might do. The other is that it's not just about wrapping our head around our grief, but it's also, it's not just about wrapping our heart around our grief, but it's also about wrapping our head around it and making sense. Again, Michael Lunick has this lovely cartoon, The Way Life is Supposed to Be, and that very messy, the way life actually is. How do we negotiate the space between those two realities? It would appear that those who struggle most with their grief are those who are trying to make sense or find some meaning in the death of this person or of the loss. And so the death of my father in his late 80s after a course of dementia, died in an aged care facility, was well supported, was present at the time of death, was a death that for me, I was able to, in a sense, make sense of. But supporting a parent whose child has been killed in terrible circumstances is an entirely different kind of challenge. And so our ability to make sense of a loss seems to be really important. So if we think of a relationship breakdown where an individual feels that this has just come totally out of the blue and it doesn't make sense, is one that can be really challenging, for example. Also, grief is not just this process where we process external experience. It often changes our sense of who we are. And grief isn't inevitably damaging. What we often see when people have engaged and struggled with profound grief is positive changes in the way they see themselves. They might talk about appreciating life more. They might talk about being more sensitive or stronger or more mature, or they take better care of themselves. But we do see in some people where they're sad and more fearful. It's harder to be close to others. And so often what we will see is that the way people's sense of who they are has changed as they kind of create often a new life following a profound experience of grief. And as I mentioned earlier, grief is not just an individual experience. We also look at the way families and workplaces and even broader cultures can either enable our grief and support our grief, or constrain it and make it more challenging and difficult. And so, we often think about how we support somebody in the context of their family or their workplace or their relationship. I really believe that many of the problems arising from bereavement are due to the failure of other people. Most of the problems people have with their grief are social problems. And it's either the difficulty or the unwillingness or the challenge that people find themselves in actually mourning together, in connecting with them. And we often hear that it's other people who are telling me I should be doing better than this, or I should be over it by now, or think of the good times. That often the difficulty people have with simply just meeting them and listening to their experience of loss. One way of thinking about grief, and I think this is the way many people think about grief, is that before the loss, we have this life that's contained by this circle, and this loss totally envelops our sense of who we are. And over time, this loss shrinks, and we find a spot for it in our lives. This idea of that Lois Tonkin, a New Zealand grief counsellor, talked about is, in fact, that's not what happens. Our grief doesn't go away, but our life expands around it to contain it. And so this idea that grief doesn't go away, but our world enlarges to be able to contain it. And I really believe that we don't reach a point where our grief is done and dusted, where it's finished. We continue to grieve, we continue to engage with loss as we age, and as we change the way we think about this experience of loss as well. But fundamentally, grief is about relearning the self. Who am I now? Who am I now in the wake of this experience? It's also about relearning the world. How do I engage and negotiate this world that's so different? As Robert Niemeyer says, grieving entails reconstructing a world of meaning that's been challenged by loss. So who am I now in the wake of this experience? And also, how do I live in this world, a world that's been changed by loss? So how might we respond to somebody? How might we have a compassionate conversation with somebody who's experienced loss? I often say that I feel that where we are in the grief and loss field is where we were in the 1960s with sex education. This is a topic that creates anxiety in people. People are worried about saying or doing the right thing. It borders on the private and the public, and it does generate anxiety for people. So what is it about supporting a grieving person that can be challenging? Well, I've made a bit of a list here of the sorts of things that we see. Generally, grieving and bereaved people are avoided. Walter Mikac, whose family were murdered at Port Arthur, and talks about going back to the town where he worked as a pharmacist and seeing one of the coaches of his daughter's sports team in the street, and their eyes briefly met, and the coach turns around and starts to walk away. And Walter thinks to himself, if I don't have this conversation now, I'll never have it. So he started walking after this man, who then started to jog. And Walter eventually caught up with him, and he grabbed him by the shoulders and gently turned him towards him, saw the tears streaming down his face, and saying, I'm sorry, Walter, I don't know what to say. And Walter's response was, it's okay. The worst things happened, but we can talk about it. And so it's this anxiety about making it worse, saying the wrong thing, that often effectively isolates a grieving person. We tend to not mention the deceased person by name. They immediately become referred to in the third person. Many grieving people want to hear the name of the person who died. Or we bring to the conversation our experience, and we don't leave space for the person to talk about their experience. It reminds me when, ... Or we change the subject, or we say something that takes them away from their feelings. Or we use platitudes or cliches, it's all for the best, or think of the good times, or so forth. I think we often do that because we're scared about saying the wrong thing. And grieving people will evaluate what is said on a basis of its intention and authenticity. We're scared we'll make it worse. Well, we can't make it worse. It also confronts us with our own mortality. If we're supporting somebody who's experienced grief, it reminds us of the possibility and the potential for us to suffer the same loss. And we also want to fix it. And grief is not something that's fixable in a normal or traditional sense. And so for me, this really sums up the need. The heart of therapeutic skill or support involves the ability to remain emotionally present in the face of deep emotional pain without needing to quickly resolve it, minimize it, or move on from it. So I often encourage people, slow down the conversation. I love the old Yiddish expression that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in those proportions. There is nothing passive about listening to somebody's story. Listening is an athletic activity. Really, it's about our ability to be with somebody and allow them to tell their story, and for us not to distract them from their pain or to minimize it or to move on from it. So I think what often people want who are grieving is they want to escape from people who inflict cheeriness, this toxic positivity. Think of the good times, and often to be able to sit with people in their sadness. They want support, they want time, they want space. They want somebody to accompany them, to be a witness to their experience. They want their feelings to be validated as real and authentic and not to be dismissed or discounted. And they want an ability and time to reflect on how they're managing. So again, this idea of listening, not fixing, staying with the person as they talk about it. And we can never underestimate what happens when somebody truly feels heard. Speaking honestly while owning our feelings, listening with empathy can really change the picture where we connect with people. So it is not that people need lots of information or even lots of words. And I often think of a woman with red curly hair whose daughter had died, and she was sitting in the emergency department of a large public hospital. And she said, lots of people came through my life that day. There were medical specialists, intensive care specialists, the neurologists, social workers, and others. But the thing that she remembered at the end of that day was a nurse with red curly hair who came to her with a cup of tea. And as she passed it, she just gently squeezed her hand and their eyes met. So for her, it was really not about the words, it was really about the quality of the care that she received from somebody. And that's what stayed with her. So what do we say? I think it's important that we acknowledge the loss. It's okay to use the word D, or the person who is dead or died, that we avoid euphemisms. We use the person's name, again, if that's culturally appropriate. And it's not always culturally appropriate to use the name of the deceased, particularly in Aboriginal communities. Ask them how they feel, listen to the answer. be okay with the silence. And also think not just in terms of the emotional support, but also the practical support that we might provide. I remember a man who said before his daughter died, he'd say to people, if you need anything, give me a call. He said, now I take myself, because people don't call, they won't call. And so he makes himself present. Again, it's important that we not say statements that minimize the loss, at least, or you should, or you will, or provide your own meaning or platitudes. He's in a better place now. We'll avoid telling people, not to respond to their grief in a particular way, and also not rushing grief by saying things like it's time to get on, move on. So people want to tell us our story because they seek a sense of safety, to be able to tell that story to us. They believe that we can hear perhaps what other people aren't able to hear. They hope that we will validate their pain as real. And in the telling, people make sense of their experience. So again, we allow time for people to tell their story without interruption. We are able to explore that pain without being overwhelmed by it. And we don't provide superficial reassurance. So again, take yourself, be present, and provide invitations for people, and to acknowledge also that people grieve in a variety of ways. Not everybody want to talk about their grief. Others might be much more private about their grief. But the expectation that we can be immersed by suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So when we're providing support to people, we are also changed by this as well. And so it's really is important that we take care of ourselves. So I want to, finish up by talking about, what I see as 12 tips for a bereaved person. And this is speaking directly, to somebody who is grieving. And the first is we need to give ourselves permission to grieve. We allow ourselves to feel whatever arises, whether that's relief or anger or sadness, that all of those feelings are valid, but that we do give ourselves the permission to grieve. Second, that we take it one day at a time. Focus on getting through the present moment, that we don't think too far ahead, which can be overwhelming. And some people talk about just thinking for the next hour or for the next day. And also accept help. Let others support you, even in small ways. We don't need to do all of this alone. And that people often, want to provide support. So it's important that we're open to accepting that. I think sometimes we can be our own worst friend, this kind of critical self-talk. I should be doing better than this. So again, don't compare your grief to the grief of others, or how you're coping. The process, your grief is unique to you. Rest when we can. Well, I think we often forget that we carry around bodies. The grief is exhausting, and that sleep is important, and that we rest where we can. We also share memories. We talk about the person. We provide opportunities, or we find people where we're able to talk not just about, in the case of death, their death, but also their life. People are much more than the way they died. And so certainly sharing stories and finding people who will listen is really important. And again, finding safe outlets for emotions. So some people might talk about keeping a journal. Grief is in many ways love that seeks expression, and we might do that through music, through art, through exercise, through fundraising for research. And so find a way for those emotions of grief to be expressed. Know that triggers are normal. It might be passing somebody in the street and smelling a perfume, or it might be seeing another child have a birthday, that these waves of grief can wash over us and it can feel fresh and raw. And this is an indication that we're not coping. that we're gentle with milestones and holidays, and we might look at creating new traditions, that we don't compare our grief, that we allow joy without guilt. And if necessary, we seek some professional support if needed. If people are talking about there aren't good days and bad days, or the grief feels as raw and intense as it was a year or 2 years ago, or there's no sense of future, then these are often things where we encourage people to seek additional support. So again, there is support out there, and our website has lots of information, resources, and fact sheets on dealing with grief. And again, I'll just put up that QR code if you want a copy of those, of the material that we've discussed today. And I've also put up there my email. I'm more than happy to receive emails from you if there are particular things we've talked about today that you'd like further information on. I think that's my time, Charla, so I'll hand back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, and what a privilege, and just your gentle approach to this space, and just so much knowledge and practical advice as well. So thank you so much. I've put in the link in the chats to Grief Australia as well. So much resources on there. Take your time to look through their website. They are the best knowledge and practice across Australia in this space. And what a privilege to have Chris to share his wisdom with us. So this is available. We'll make this available online as a webinar, and you can watch it later as well. So feel free to share it with your other volunteer colleagues. Look after yourselves, and really we all have a role to play in this space. So take this knowledge on board, and let's see how we can all wrap everyone around in love, like you said, in this area. Have a beautiful day, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Chris, and to your team.
Thanks for coming.
And lovely. Okay. See you later, everyone. Bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.